What a year it has been. We could say that at the end of just about any year. I mean, I've been alive since the early 1950s, and every year has had major news stories. This is something that media outlets do in December. And for it's not the end of 2022 for Hot Media with Bob Mann. I am going to be doing one more episode, and it's going to be a lot happier than this. It's going to be about top Christmas movies of all time. But in this episode, we're looking at the top news stories of 2022. And whenever we talk about journalism, I like to bring on my friend Rem Rieder. And Rem has an illustrious career, in addition to being on this podcast and the satellite radio show which preceded it. And he has been the managing editor of the American Journalism Review. He has been a features editor at large and with USA Today, and is right now an adjunct professor of journalism at Widener University in Pennsylvania. Rem, I'm certain I never get your titles totally right, but whether they're off by a little bit or exact, they are impressive. And thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's just begin by talking about the idea that if you mention a top five, although that seems to be very popular on the internet these days to do that, you leave so many things out. But let's just talk a little bit about something that really is going to make anybody's top 10 list, and that is Ukraine. And Ukraine, in addition to being covered by the media, has a unique media angle. Just today, as we record on December 15th, 2022, the New York Times lead story, at least in the digital edition, is the Russian propaganda and the way that they're spinning the war in Ukraine, as if they're winning, as if their cause is just. And one of their favorite people to go to quote, is Tucker Carlson, an American television personality. Give us kind of an overview, because of the fact that if you look back, Ukraine has pretty much been in the news all of 2022. This really hit in February.
No, it's a huge and very important story. And Tucker Carlson's role is really appalling, as is the role of a number of kind of fringe Republicans who have not seemed to see the importance of the war in Ukraine and seem more sympathetic to the Russian side, which I just can't get my arms around. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Republican Party was staunchly anti-communist and
Joe McCarthy. It's the party of Joe McCarthy.
And instead, we've got this sympathy for the Russians, and we have, Kevin McCarthy a couple of months ago saying we shouldn't give Ukraine a blank check, and whereas I think that the Democrats in this case, who used to be accused all the time of being soft on communism, Biden has done a great job, I think, on Ukraine in terms of staunchly backing the Ukrainians and pushing for more arms and weaponry for them. And I find the Carlson's defense and that of some other fringe people is just appalling and very hard to understand. This sympathy for the poor Russians in a case of just total aggression by the Russians, and the surprising success on the battlefield of the Ukrainians and the failures of the supposedly mighty Russians.
Of course, when it comes to American media in general, you have Time Magazine making Zelensky the Person of the Year, things of that nature. But here are just some of the theories that I've heard, Rem, about sympathy for the devil, so to speak. And that is that, first of all, Trump adores Putin. He is his kind of dictator. So I guess those who adore Trump would adore Putin. But I also heard one of my other usual suspects on here, Dan Cassino, a political science professor. And what he mentioned was that Vladimir Putin actually shares an agenda with the very far right wing, especially when it comes to evangelicals and that part of the far right wing, the idea of being very tough on gays, being extremely anti-gay, and being the advocate of what is basically a single religion state. Do you see those as possible motivations for rooting for the bad guy?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. There are possible motivations. It's hard, it's hard to know exactly what's at play here, but it's just been an appalling development and something that you wouldn't think would be a tough decision. You would think this might be something that he would go beyond the polarization that we see on almost every issue. And in fact, there are Republicans who have been loyal to the cause of helping Ukraine. Mitch McConnell among them. So it's not like the entire Republican Party has turned its back on NATO. It's turned its back on defeating Russian aggression.
Yeah,
It's just shocking that there's even an element of it that's doing it.
right. If we're going to be fair, we have to point out that this is a far right extreme. Although Tucker Carlson has hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of loyal viewers and followers. If
That's a good
you
point. I mean,
are
it's we're not really just talking fringe here. He has a huge audience, and a lot of people who pay attention to him.
If you look down the line, obviously inflation is one of the big stories. Ren, what I find is, especially with the audience and even very educated, well informed people in the audience, inflation is something hard to understand. It is very easy to talk about in terms of daily pain. We all have it at the gas pump, we all have it at the supermarket. But it is very hard to really pin down some of the causes. Do you think that that is one of the biggest challenges journalists face in dealing with this story, which just does not seem to go away?
Yeah, I do think it's a big challenge because like so many economic stories, it is complicated and it's not something that journalists necessarily know a lot about. And it's also one of these things that's very simplistic to point blame. Like one part of inflation, as you alluded to, is gas prices. And there was as gas prices kept going up, there were the endless memes on the internet of thanks Biden. Well, frankly, the American president doesn't have a lot to do with uh, gas prices, and in fact, inflation as well. I mean, these are international phenomena. They're not just happening here, uh, and so it's important for journalists to be sophisticated about that and point that out. That being said, I mean there's no doubt the Biden administration, and I think a lot of the media narrative was slow to catch up. Oh, maybe a year ago with what an important problem this was, and there was a tendency by the Biden administration and to kind of blame supply chain issues, COVID. It's a temporary thing, and to completely underestimate how serious the problem was. So I think that was a problem both for the administration and the media. But I think also as it goes on, it's important for the media to point out the complexities and the international nature of these problems. The other thing that's really striking is when gas prices were soaring, the Fox, not just the Fox News is either. Fox News was all over that story 24/7, like a caravan of immigrants in Latin America. But so was a lot of the so-called mainstream media. And as prices of gasoline have declined, there hasn't been nearly that attention. I mean, that's an age-old journalism thing where the bad news always gets more attention than the good news. But it's really, in fairness, important to point that out. If you made a huge deal of this when it was going up, to point out we've had X number of days of decline.
Let's talk about the fact that these two stories that I led off with as number one and number two, Ukraine and inflation, are somewhat tied together, either because of the fact that people who are out to make the Biden administration look bad think that this is just an easy anti-Biden issue, but
Yeah.
also the fact that there is Russian oil and that there are restrictions concerning Russian oil that you can't deny is inexorably tied with the idea of inflation in this country. Not that I really understand why gas prices go up and down. I just remember even when I was just had a driver's license sitting on long gas lines that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. But those two things are to some degree tied, right?
They are, and I'm not a sophisticated enough economist or economic analyst to know precisely how much, but sure, that's a factor. I don't think it's a huge factor, but it's. I mean, and Biden made efforts for a while to blame Putin for the problems at the pump, and I think it was somewhat disingenuous.
Let's talk about politics for story number three, and that is the midterm election and also what was supposed to be the red wave. Some people have mocked it and called it the red trickle. Were you surprised? Do you think that journalists in general were surprised on both sides of the political dialogue? Well, it's not dialogue, the political isolation that we have in this country, that the Republicans didn't sweep in the manner that they thought they would?
I thought that I'm always leery, as you know, of saying the media did this or the media did that, since the media is made up of an awful lot of very different entities. But
Right.
nevertheless,
It's everything from MSNBC and the New York Times to Fox News and OAN. I mean, that all of that is under
exactly.
the
And
umbrella of the media. That's so true.
I love it when Fox News is attacking the corporate media. What could be more corporate media than Fox News?
The
And
Murdochs.
and your point too is also, I think people often throw in posts on social media, along with professional journalism. That being said, there's no doubt the dominant media narrative going into this election was the Republicans were going to do very well. It was going to be, there were stories saying it would be the end of Joe Biden's career. The gains were going to be huge. The Democrats had made a big mistake in worrying so much about the crisis in democracy and not talking more about crime. And this is a pattern. The media narrative about this election in advance was totally wrong. And that happens all the time because the media, much of the media, I'm not going to fall on that trap, but much of the media and the mainstream media, the DC political media, spend too much time predicting and saying, worrying about what's going to happen, as opposed to what we call horse race stories. That's so much what we see. And yes, people want to know who's going to win. Sure. But the thing is, we often don't know, and often the polls don't know. And yet, the writing was with such certainty, with some good exceptions, uh, that the Republicans were going to do so well. So I thought it was an enormous embarrassment for much of the DC political media. And what's more important about it to me, it reflects a problem we see all the time. Just like the narrative in 2016 was Hillary Clinton is, of course, going to handily defeat Donald Trump. Or years before that, Hillary Clinton is definitely going to win the nomination for Barack Obama. Over and over again, the media narrative, and there often is a prevalent one out of the DC political media, is wrong. And it's just, you would think at some point someone would learn a lesson from this and spend more time uh, analyzing issues and that kind of thing than making facile predictions that blow up on the people making them.
You could blame it on having to fill 24/7 on all news cable. However, there still is that 1948 famous headline being held up by Harry Truman. I think it was a major Chicago paper. Dewey defeats Truman.
It's a great
It's
one
been
and a
going on for
great
a
point.
while.
So we didn't invent this. It was a Chicago Tribune, in fact. Uh, but we've certainly perfected it. Uh, and you're absolutely right. Cable plays a role in this because there's all that time to fill. And we talk about there's cable news stations, but a lot of time is cable talk. And obviously, the internet has a lot to do with it too, and social media propelling this. But it's just, you would think after time of humiliation, maybe we'd back up a little, but we don't. And there's no reason to think it'll be any different in the future.
Well, to slightly update Billy Joel lyrics, we didn't start the fire. But in this case, we have certainly poured gasoline on it. That
Perfectly said.
when it comes to that, moving down the line, I realize that this is not one single story, not one single event, but the fact that there are so many of these single events makes it a major story, and that is gun violence. So many incidents as we record about 600 actually categorized, with clear cut criteria, mass shootings in the country, thousands, tens of thousands of people dead. This is something that is probably always going to be covered along political lines. We just passed the anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of Sandy Hook. Is this something that can ever be properly covered? Or is this something where people are horrified for days, then alternative narratives come up? Talk a little bit about the idea of mass shootings as a story that just does not go away in our country, and where this coverage might be going.
I think there were actually two interlocking stories here. There's sort of the mass shootings, and there are a lot of shootings that are mass shootings. And this is a problem. The Onion runs that wonderful story every time there's a mass shooting. Uh, the headline is something like, "Nothing can be done, says only country that experiences this problem." So, enormous problem. And as you say, enormous politicization. But now I think it's also related to the broader problem of gun violence itself, which is, yes, mass shootings, but individual shootings. And since the pandemic, these have the whole gun violence issue has had an enormous impact on the country. I see it in Philadelphia, where I live, where we've made great progress, and in the last few years, gun violence as both of the mass and kind of day to day nature have become an incredibly serious problem that really hurts the overall fabric of the country. And it's true in lots of other big cities. Uh, Even in your beloved New York, which for years has had a much lower violent crime rate than many smaller cities, has seen an upsurge. And I know there were times when crime was worse. Nevertheless, we've seen in a lot of these cities a huge uptick, and I think you'd argue that's in terms of news stories, that's one of the major problems facing the country. To get back to your original question about mass shootings, it's just stunning how they've become kind of everyday stories because there are so many of them. I was talking to my one of my classes at Widener University about this, and uh, you're just a youngster, but you might remember this, that in the 60s, there was a mass shooting in Texas called the Texas Tower shooting, where a guy named Charles Whitman went up on top of a tower and started picking people off. And the thing was so prevalent that it had such an impact that all these days later, I remember his name. And then the shooting had a name. Today, there are mass shootings that don't even crack the national news. It's like, okay, it's Tuesday, and I think that's an appalling problem. And because of the politicization, we can't deal with it. I don't understand whether no matter how you love your militia's right to have guns, how you couldn't get behind legislation to ban automatic weapons. That would leave your militias in pretty good shape and your hunters in good shape. And yet, it's at such a flashpoint. Biden did manage to get a relatively small bore, but nevertheless the first federal gun legislation passed in decades. But it's just so hard to get anything passed. So as you were saying, even the ones that capture the national attention, like the recent one, say at the LGBTQ nightclub, or there's some that become high profile stories, some don't. But there's the initial outrage, and it's not even shock anymore, and demands to do something, and nothing happens. I mean, thoughts and prayers has become kind of a joke, and it's one of the most depressing things to me about where we are is how little as a nation we can do about it.
I love The Onion, and I did not know about that title. I love satire. Of course, it's a form of comedy, but it can be a very powerful and biting political statement as well. And the idea is that nothing can be done, says the only country that has this problem. That is pretty powerful.
And you're so right about satire, as we used to say after 9/11. If we can't laugh anymore, the terrorists have won.
It's very true. It's very true. I had trouble, Rem, coming up with a number five. It was a bit of a tie. I was going to go with Trump troubles until our pre-interview prep, and you mentioned about Twitter. And I would have to say that Twitter is in that top five because Elon Musk may be a bigger threat to democracy than Donald Trump at this point. Talk a little bit about, I mean, we've done a lot of shows about Twitter, and I don't know if you know this, but there was an episode, not one where you were the guest, where I actually deleted my Twitter, my Twitter account. I have heard other people my age call Twitter Tweeter, but that is not why I made that flub. My Twitter account, I deleted it right on the air. It didn't change Elon's mind about anything, but wow, that has become quite a place.
By that.
Say that again.
Elon told me when you did that, he was shaken by it.
He was good. I'm glad I had some impact. And even if that's just not true at all, thank you for saying it. Talk a little bit about Twitter, though, and where Musk now stands in this bizarre political / media spectrum.
Well, I mean, the whole thing is fascinating. I happen to think that Twitter, whatever its flaws, has been a really important part of our political and social and journalistic life. And a Washington writer mentioned to me recently that a lot of things that were kind of hashed out among journalists over drinks are now hashed out in public over Twitter, political issues and the like. And it's kind of for many people an invaluable way to kind of keep pace with what's happening. And so Musk, in buying it, has done two things. First of all, he's kind of put Twitter at risk. And second, he is really, I mean, he clearly wants to be at the center of conversation. I mean, he reminds me in many ways of Trump. And he has certainly achieved that. I mean, it's all Musk all the time for a certain group of people who should have something better to do follow this stuff. I certainly am in that camp. But the fact that he is brought back a lot of banned accounts that included hate speech. He reinstated Trump on there. He called for a Republican triumph in the midterms. The New York Times, which has some political blind spots, said this. I'm sure you saw it. Kind of ridiculous story about a week ago. It's like, well, it's kind of hard to see where where Elon Musk's politics are. And 2 days later came that unforgettable tweet from Musk managing to alienate people on a number of levels, saying my personal pronouns are prosecute and Fauci. Uh, so talk about we talk about tweets that don't age well. The Times story, which was pretty bad at the beginning, didn't age well either. But clearly, Musk is determined to be in the center of the political conversation in this country, and he is a force. And he has a bunch of a lot of similar to the Trump phenomenon, a lot of people who very much admire him and support him. And he's created an issue. You took a bold stand on this, but a lot of us are out there saying, well, is it better to kind of cut and run, or should we fight it out here, or is it a losing battle? But he certainly has made himself a huge part of the political and social and technological conversation.
Well, let's wrap up then. We'll make this 5B, Trump troubles. Again, I think I don't like to use the phrase Trump is right, but he was right when he said that he could walk out on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, shoot someone and get away with it. This year seems to be proving that more than anything. But he's had his share of troubles. For him, I guess they're nothing more than annoyances. But everything from investigations about top secret documents and Mar-a-Lago to New York taxes, he certainly has not had a free ride, even if it never stops him.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right. That's about the truest. That line about Fifth Avenue is about one of the truest statements ever made. When you think of how long ago it was and how many career-ending scandals that didn't end any careers ago. That was. Nevertheless, he's had a brutal year. Uh, and in terms, I'd be surprised if the Mar-a-Lago classified documents doesn't lead to an indictment. His company has just uh, been convicted. He faces that Georgia investigation for his election phone call, looking for votes. A lot of his handpicked candidates got clobbered, and he kind of takes a lot of the blame for the disappointing Republican showing in the midterms. And we're beginning to see what looks like an erosion of his stranglehold on the party. But with the caveat that, as you said, how many times in the past have we said, like with the good the tape, Access Hollywood tape. Oh, nobody can ride this out. So I
Right.
think,
How could the religious right stand behind somebody who's made such repulsive statements? But
and
they
had
did.
no impact at all. So who knows? It does seem like he's got a lot of the legal consequences looming. And second, like as if his hold is beginning to weaken. But I would counting him out at any time, particularly given in the timidity, the cowardice in the Republican Party, the fear of Trump. It's not over till it's over.
Yeah, I mean, maybe DeSantis could. I don't see Pence offering him much opposition, and I didn't think Pence was very impressive with David Muir that particular time. You can see them just gathering around him yet again.
I think if there are a lot, if the thing is that there are a lot of opponents, it could be like the last time where he picks them off one by one. If we're more of a one-on-one with DeSantis, who knows? But there's a school of thought that is, I think, Ron Wilson, the Republican, Rick Wilson, excuse me, the Republican consultant and a big anti-Trumper, says he's convinced that DeSantis has a glass jaw, and to use a boxing expression, and wouldn't really be able to stand up against a sustained combat with Trump.
Well, it is amazing, and of course, there's no predicting the future. Although I'm certain there are media outlets that are going to be saying, "What will be the biggest stories of 2023?" Nobody predicted COVID. You didn't think there would be a war in Europe. We thought there'd never be a war in Europe again. This is all
Exactly.
done once you had the euro. But there's no predicting, and that's what makes the world pretty scary. But the media is there to be the fourth estate, at least now, and the watchdog. And Rem, I thank you very much always for being on this podcast to help us make sense of the news media, whatever constitutes whatever group you want to put together and call it the media.
The
So
media.
I thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure, Bob. Thank you.
I just ask you to hang on until I sign off, and then I'll talk to you as soon as I stop recording on here.
Sounds
That
good.
is Rem Rieder, one of our absolute favorite guests right here on this episode of Hot Media with Bob Mann. That's it for this episode, and please join us every week. We talk about the hottest content and hottest issues in the media, and that includes news, entertainment, and we're going back to entertainment next week, and even sports. Rem and I didn't even get a chance to talk about everything from the Phillies to the Yankees and Villanova, but we'll do that some other time. Maybe I'll create a sports podcast. But we certainly hope that since I have now dropped my Twitter feed, that you will at least go to my website, which is www.bobmanhotmedia.com. For those of you not seeing the video, that's BOBMANN, www.bobmanhotmedia.com. And you can follow me on Instagram, also BobMan92. And we will take a brief break after that Best Christmas Movies next week. But we do plan, can't predict the future, but do plan to be here in 2023 to continue to talk about the media, whatever the media happen to actually be. So thank you for joining us. And of course, we ask you, whether it's on audio or video, to please subscribe.